and defer any items that we need to vote on. And we're going to save the budget presentation towards the end, and therefore we're going to start off with our regional express bus service proposal. And we are very fortunate to have here our very own Forward Pinellas Executive Director, Mr. Whit Blanton.
Well, thanks for having me today.
Madam Chair, just, as far as the quorum, we have 3 members here.
I was told we don't have quorum. Is that correct?
Oh, we have a quorum, sorry.
Okay,
do
I
have
was
quorum.
misinformed. We do have quorum.
Do you want me to proceed, or do you want to go back?
Go ahead and proceed. We'll come back and do the minutes.
Okay. All right, well, thanks for having me this morning. I'll keep this fairly brief. As you can see, this is a presentation that I gave to the Transportation Management Area Leadership Group back on June 2nd. And we put this together to really think about how we can work regionally to improve transportation throughout the Tampa Bay area. And Regional Express Bus has been something that has been operational in Tampa Bay for as long as I've worked here, since the 1980s. And it's met with, I think, what we would call less than stellar success in terms of the cross-bay routes that operate. But as we think about developing better regional transportation, and you know the Regional Premium Transit Study is underway, that HART is leading, we need to take another fresh look at this, because this is what I refer to as the missing middle of transit. You know, we have fixed guideway plans on one hand, and then we have good local bus service and circulators and trolleys on the other end, but we really don't do a great job of addressing that middle type of transit that is lower cost, but yet provides a good travel option for folks. So we wanted to look at how can we present real choices for commuters and travelers in the near term, as opposed to something that might be 10, 15 years down the road. How do we begin to develop the regional transit market that we know is out there, but we haven't been able to tap into very effectively yet? How do we fill a complementary role with other transportation services, whether it be the local fixed route core network here in Pinellas, or it be even Uber and Lyft, or Park and Ride, or other types of premium transit service that may be developed in the future. And then can we agree among all of our entities involved in regional and local transportation, commit to an investment package as part of a defined regional strategy? And I think that's the biggest objective for me, is let's get together as a group of planning and implementing agencies and say this is the way we need to go to grow ridership and to unite our counties throughout the Tampa Bay area. And the nice thing about Express Bus is that it is flexible, it is adaptable, and if after 2 or 3 years you are not seeing the results that you think you should be seeing, it can be adjusted. And I use this for a lot of folks who aren't as involved in transportation, but we have a lot of different markets that we try to serve in transportation, in transit in particular, and then there are a lot of different ways to serve that, and Express Bus fills a need. It fills a niche that's not been served well over time. So there are a lot of successful examples of regional Express Bus entities, and the one that I'm most familiar with and having worked with is in the Piedmont area of North Carolina. It's called PART, Piedmont Area Regional Transportation Authority, and they operate a network of regional express bus from North Wilkesboro all the way into Greensboro, Winston-Salem area, and that's not that comparable to Tampa Bay, but at the same time, it's an area of multiple MPOs and multiple transit providers, and PART fills an important niche in that market as well. And so this is something that has been on the TMA regional priority list for about 2 years now. And so I put this presentation together because I don't think there was a lot of understanding about what we mean by regional express bus and how do we begin advancing that program a little bit. It may not be a traditional bus. It could be privately operated, could be a van type vehicle, or it could be something like the 595 Express that operates between Broward County and Miami-Dade County, that was initiated through the joint efforts of the transit agencies and the Florida Department of Transportation. And this is something that would also, I think, complement the van pool program that TBar operates. And this is just a graphic depicting how it could begin to take shape. We put a map together of the current routes that are operating in Hillsborough, Pasco, and Pinellas. These are the core routes that are identified here, as well as other routes. And these are the 300, the 200, and the 100X that have been operating, like I said, since about 1988 or so that these have been in existence. And while maybe the service has changed a little bit, the basic structure of those routes has not changed much. It was originally 100% funded by FDOT, and I think after about 10 or 15 years, when it should have expired after 3 years, they gradually began shifting some of the operating costs to the local providers, but DOT still maintains some functional role, I believe, in all 3 of the routes, or at least 2 of the 3 routes. We do understand that HART, due to some budget challenges on its side of the bay, is pulling back from its express bus because, generally speaking, they haven't been as productive as the local fixed route, so that is something to consider. But I also don't think we've really tried very hard to make express bus work for a lot of different reasons. Just conceptually, the darker lines here show the regional express routes that have been in some level of planning conversation. And the Veterans Expressway route, there was a study done a few years ago, but there's really been no dollars committed to that from Pasco down into Hillsborough. The TIAA Clearwater Beach Express is something that's a priority of PSTA. We have been in discussions with PSTA also about the 727 or the downtowner that connects from downtown St. Pete to downtown Tampa. That's a reconfiguration of the 100X. And lately, we've been talking about a US 19 Express, maybe network of 1 or 2 routes that might begin operating in that corridor. And I just find it odd that we aren't really working hard on really good express connections along our major north-south corridor and between our 2 downtowns. And I think those are low-hanging fruit opportunities in addition to the State Road 60 corridor. And we don't show it, but Oldsmar is another opportunity that we should begin to look at because Oldsmar's population in the daytime is 40,000 and at nighttime it's about 10,000. And if you're looking at express bus, it really does tie into the commuter market. So I think Oldsmar could present an opportunity for us. These are the express routes that may be changing in Hillsborough County, and they have a different approach to them than we might regionally, but I think it's still something useful for background information. And then longer term, certainly there's a lot of growth in Manatee County. Pasco County is 500,000 people today. But by 2030 or so, they're expecting to be 900,000, which is the equivalent of our population today, more or less. And we need to begin looking at those opportunities as well, and maybe even on into Hernando County. Now, with the new TBAR that went into effect, I guess maybe July 1 is when it goes into effect. That's now a transit-focused agency, and these express routes could be something that TBAR begins to champion as an agency with a new governing board that'll be seated in time for the August 25th meeting, we hope. So the entire network begins to look like this, and if you threw this up on a map to anybody randomly out there who's not familiar with our area, they would say, look, you got a pretty good, robust transit network. Well, the devil is in the details. Not all of these are in existence, but I think it begins to show how you can stitch together a good local network and a good regional network. So the planned express routes would include the replacement of the 200X by the Clearwater Beach to TIAA Express, and maybe potentially continuing that on into downtown someday. The 100X changing into the downtowner, and then additional links into Pasco County. This also shows the Central Avenue BRT route and how it could tie into that. So in terms of optimizing regional transit, there are a number of things that we have to consider. And it's in conversations with FDOT, they've said things like, well, park and ride hasn't really worked, and regional express bus hasn't really worked, but have we given it the opportunity? Have we really given it our full investment? I don't think the answer is yes on those things. So when we look at this, we have to look at what is the right span of service. Do we run just in the peak period, or do we try to run more 12-hour, 16-hour type service? What's the frequency? Is it good enough to have a bus every hour or every couple hours, or should we be running buses every half hour or even more in some cases? What's the right technology? How does the fare payment, the fare card, regional fare card play into this? And I think there's a real strong link between the regional fare card and cross-bay, cross-county service. And then how do we really focus on things like a parking strategy? Especially with connected and autonomous vehicles, we're not going to need the parking garages and maybe the surface parking that we've been required to provide by our codes. So maybe we can look at parking caps in our core employment areas, or at least less of a parking footprint than we have today. So that's a land use strategy that we really need to bring to bear on this that we haven't. We are working on this idea of 20-minute neighborhoods in Pinellas County. Most of our park and ride and express bus service today don't really tie into places that are walkable. And that's, again, I think, on the land use side of things as much as anything. And then how do we look at operational strategies like the Bus on Shoulder pilot project that is currently under study for the 275 corridor? What can we say about other operational strategies that might give preferential treatment to transit vehicles that are key to regional mobility, such as transit signal priority or signal priority for transit vehicles? And that, I think, would go a long way towards giving people a sense that this is not just your typical bus. This is a better than average service. This is going to get you there faster. It's going to be competitive with automobile travel times. And frankly, if I'm stuck on a bridge due to a crash, I'd just as soon not be behind a wheel and have the flexibility of doing some work and getting that done. And I think that's part of the message that we can provide to commuters and others, because there's nothing more frustrating than sitting in your car and not being able to do anything but listening to talk radio, which is really frustrating. So I think we've got to approach this on a full front way of dealing with this, because you can see on the graphic here, there's really no good statewide funding source for regional transportation, and I'll just leave it broad at that. This is a graph of the Transportation Regional Incentive Program that was created in 2006 by the legislature, and it's a 50-50 match with local governments or with other operating entities to address mobility needs in congested corridors. And those dollar amounts have fluctuated wildly, and the latest 2017 figures are lower than even the 11 million. They're down around 2 million. And that's just not enough to do much of anything. It's not transportation, it's not regional, and it's not much of an incentive, and therefore it's not really a program. So I've had conversations with many of our legislative delegation members, and I'm meeting this afternoon with Representative Ben Diamond, who used to be on the PSTA board, and they're very interested in shoring up this gap and providing some sort of funding incentive for agencies to work together, to collaborate, and to maybe go so far as to align some of their administrative, planning, and operational functions. That seems to be the desire these days. Well, give us some carrots. Give us some incentives, if that's what you want us to do, that can really deliver a better product. So we need to look at how do we promote this as a package and not just put it on the shoulders of the transit providers to get this done. So what I think the MPOs would be willing to do is to make this a priority in our annual priority list, in our TIP. I think that if we had a source of funding that we could go for, then we would be huge champions. And I think we need to break out of the mold of, you've got your budget issues over here, you've got your budget issues over here. How do we begin to combine resources to fill the gap to make this happen? And then let's use this as a way to deliver some type of better service that can generate higher levels of ridership. I think it can. And then we have a better ask when we go to the federal government and ask for some kind of regional fixed guideway investment at some point in the future that may come out of the regional transit plan that HART is leading. So I'll leave it here. I think this is my last slide other than discussion to see if you have any feedback or questions or direction for me that we can take back to the MPO board at our July meeting or to the TMA leadership group in the September meeting.
What's the reason for the big deviation in the statewide trip funding?
Those dollars come from documentary stamps, and they tend to get repurposed. In the recession years of 2009 to 2011, they were used to shore up the basic operating budget of the state. So they went back into the general revenue fund. Lately, they've been going into things like housing and even environmental preservation efforts because those dollars have been repurposed too. So it's really just a free-for-all with the funds that were previously purposed for TRIP.
So, and those are millions of dollars?
Those are millions.
7 million?
Yes. And even 227 million doesn't go very far statewide. So it's been very competitive.
And this is the state funding available, and there's federal funding available?
No federal for this, not for TRIP. This is just state, and again, what you see here has to be matched. So if there's 227 million, they're counting on 227 million from local governments, which at the rate we're cutting property taxes, that's probably not going to happen. So I'm open to whether this new program would be 50-50 match. I think that's okay. But I think we need to provide some incentives out there that folks can go for.
So it does or does not include a 50-50 match locally?
Currently it does.
Thank you, Manager.
So is this where I jump in and say, I know how we can increase our funding for, for transportation disadvantage? I don't know what that's about.
You know, I guess there's a relationship there, but I'm not sure. It probably, you know, if we were to develop a regional express bus that ran throughout the day, I would say there's a very complementary role there. And even in the peak period, getting to medical appointments, absolutely. I think there's a role.
I have recently found out that we have a lot of people in Pinellas that are traveling to Moffett
Yep, that's right.
every single day.
Mhm.
And it's an expensive trip, not only for us, but for them.
Right.
So,
I think, you know, the strategy has long been to get TD riders onto the fixed route system, and that would, to me, apply to the express bus network if it goes where they need to go. And Moffett is an anchor regionally, absolutely.
So one of the next steps would be to get the Fort Pinellas to add this to our priority list, but then also work the Hillsborough side of the bay too.
Mhm.
The other MPOs as well, regional MPOs?
I think
or mostly-
Pasco is very interested in this. They were very supportive at the TMA meeting. You know, their only comment was they quibbled with the lines just going to Pasco County. You know, I said, well, help us. You know, tell us where you think they should go. I think the government complex at Little Road and 54 and I-75 makes tons of sense to bring Pasco County commuters. And it was funny, I was at the Coalition of North County Neighborhoods up in Palm Harbor on Monday night, and a lot of hue and cry up there on the traffic congestion on East Lake Road, which they blame on Pasco County commuters coming into Pinellas County. And the suggestion from people in the audience there was we need express bus service coming down either 19 or East Lake Road that takes some of those Pasco commuters off the road. You know, it's low density up there, so we really need to think about, in that location, park and ride, and really a thoughtful location for a good park and ride lot. And DOT does have money for park and ride, but we've got to convince the department that it's a good investment. And they typically don't want to lease park and ride lots; they want to buy them outright, and that's been an impediment in some areas where you can't find a willing seller where you know the park and ride needs to go, but you could lease space, and DOT won't participate in a lease agreement. At least that used to be the case in District 4, so we need to investigate that further. The outcome of the TMA leadership group is that they directed us to meet with the transit agencies to refine this program and bring something back to them. I don't think we have to do it as early as September, but maybe to coincide with the beginning of the year, 2018, when we'll have the results and the recommendations of the Regional Premium Transit Study, and this to me is a good implementation interim step.
It seems too that with Steinem's resignation and a new director coming in, it seems like this is a good opportunity to work with a new person coming. I mean, I'm presuming it's someone new. It might be someone who's already been around for a little while, but it seems like it's an opportunity to work with some new blood at FDOT.
Absolutely, yeah. And we've got to change the conversation about transit in Florida in general.
Mm-hmm.
The folks in DOT and central office are, how do I say this nicely? They're kind of stuck in their ways. They, it's not broken, let's don't fix it, but I think it is broken. And we have not changed our funding mechanisms or our investment at the state level in transit since roughly about 1989, when the block grant program went into effect. There was the creation of a New Starts program in Florida in the mid-2000s, but we haven't really been able to tap into that very effectively, except now we've got the Central Avenue BRT. So there's really not been much shift in state thinking on transit in a long, long time.
Mr. Johnson?
The current funding for the regional buses comes out of TRIP, or where does that come from?
That's maybe a Cassandra question. I think the current funding comes out of the congested corridor or corridor development program. It started as a service development project that's supposed to end after 3 years, but do they still have a congested corridor program? They did a long time ago.
No, it's called the Urban Corridor.
Urban Corridor
Program. So
Program.
there's two ways to get operational funding from DOT. One is through the Urban Corridor, and the other one is service development. So a lot of times we talk about service development because it's a 50-50 match that is eligible for the first 3 years of the operation. The Urban Corridor funding is ongoing, but it has not increased. And so over the years of services being provided for the 100X and the 300X, the percentage share of the operations that FDOT is covering has been dropping. So while it may have started out as a larger match, it's really only about 15% of the operating costs of those services. So while it's very valuable, that pot of money at central office has not been increasing. And so it's very difficult to get new projects funded through that urban corridor. Not that we haven't tried. We are trying. We have put in some applications for new urban corridor funding, and it has been on our legislative agenda to talk about that funding source of these urban corridors and specifically looking at regional connections. So in the last legislative session, our discussion about the TIAA2T Express was centered around FDOT funding that grant pot more robustly.
By putting more money in the urban corridor pot?
And allowing regional services to be funded more robustly out of it.
And theoretically,
Theoretically, it's 100% money.
at least somewhat in the works over in the Orlando area, the legislature or the DOT could earmark a influx of funding into that urban corridor funds for the Clearwater Beach to TIAA Express route. And that's what our legislative strategy has been for the last 2 years.
And two reasons for that. One might be maintenance of traffic, as both the causeway, two of the causeways are going to be under construction. Even though they're supposed to keep the same number of lanes open, that's going to have some congestion from Looky Loos
That would be a good argument for it.
The other was thinking back to the Bald Bay Area Legislative Delegation. They were so critical of this region for not having cross bay routes. And so the issue is, so put some money behind your mouth. But the other thing I think is that they've got to be the right route. And do we know what the right route is? You were talking about the downtown to downtown, but what about downtown to West Shore? I mean, there's a lot.
Right.
And how do we determine what the best connection is?
Well, I think we've got the staff, and certainly if we need to bring consultants in, we can do that. But I think we have a good sense of where stops need to be. The key with this is you can't have too many stops. You're probably looking at 1 or 2, 3 stops at most, because that'll just kill travel time. So you have to be thoughtful about it, and you have to reach agreements that the stops are in the right location. And like in West Shore, I have a meeting with Ann Kulik, who is the West Shore Alliance Director, next week, and we're going to talk about this. She was at the TMA meeting. She's very excited about it. She's interested. So you need private partners like that as well. The other source of funding that we haven't talked about that we certainly can is strategic intermodal system funds. SIS dollars are typically not used for transit, and they're tightly held by the state on interstates and major corridors like US 19. But if this is giving an option and providing another way of people to use those corridors more efficiently and reduce some of the strain on those corridors, it absolutely should be eligible. Miami-Dade is pushing hard for SIS dollars to be eligible for their transit program. And I've had conversations with their MPO director, and we'd like to bring together a coalition of major urban metropolitan areas to advocate for this in a unified way. So Jacksonville, Orlando, Broward, Miami-Dade, and the Tampa-St. Pete area. I think we could make a pretty good argument that SIS dollars in those urban areas could be repurposed and should be. And frankly, we're slated to spend $1 billion building interchanges in the far northern reaches of Pinellas County. I can think of a lot better use of $1 billion than interchanges to nowhere. And that's the conversation we're trying to have. I mean, we'll build them to a point, but then at a certain point, Pasco County doesn't want those interchanges. So, where do we begin to ramp down? And I think we ramp down at Tampa Road and save ourselves $800 million and repurpose those dollars in other ways. Right now, that's not a policy of the Florida Department of Transportation. So that's why we need the ear of the new secretary, and there are 2 new secretaries, one in central office and one to be here in District 7.
And I think that there's been some movement at the department for the capital dollars, and central office has been on again, off again about this bus on shoulders concept, especially with the lane continuity issues between Gandy and downtown St. Pete, and in light of how it connects to Tampa Bay Next. So they've been willing to talk about that, but it's more of a longer-term strategy, and it still doesn't give us the operational dollars that we need in order to put these services out on the road.
So a lot of moving parts are converging.
Yeah, well, speaking of that, the Tampa Bay Next project, which I heard a presentation of yesterday at the St. Pete Chamber of Commerce, is having a workshop on July 13th, I think it is?
Yes.
Here in their Pinellas workshop is at the Epicenter on July 13th. And the consultants, the DOT pays their consultants to go give presentations to hostile crowds, like the St. Pete Chamber yesterday. There wasn't anybody from the DOT there, but the St. Pete Chamber asked the poor consultant 25 ways why isn't transit being considered, and why doesn't, and then very explicitly the consultant showed that Tampa Bay Next, even though it had pictures of transit and the St. Petersburg skyline, including Tropicana Field, doesn't go to St. Petersburg. Downtown St. Petersburg, it goes to Gandy Boulevard because it's really the express lanes, and there was no answers. But there was a discussion, as Whit has just described. Well, transit is funded in a different way. You have to come up with a 50% match for anything you do for transit. Meanwhile, the entire interstate SIS network is 100% funded. The local governments do not provide any match for the Howard Franklin Bridge, for the Gateway Express. It's free to us. And the DOT says, well, Pinellas County, Hillsborough County, you have to come up with 50% of the money on that if you want to do transit. So the St. Pete Chamber talked about sending a good contingency to that July 13th meeting and trying, but it was somewhat disappointing. In the meanwhile, back to reality, what we've been doing at PSTA is planning on putting together an RFP for express bus services that would include our our existing 100 and 300X. It would also include an option to provide this Clearwater Beach to TIAA Express and bring that back to the PSTA board. We would do a procurement and we would incorporate with, coordinate it with HART, so we could include a number of the routes that would is showing, including the ones over in Hillsborough, that they might contemplate with their redesign, and put together a package. And then, you know, theoretically, we'd then have a solid price. We'd have a vendor. We'd have the vehicles, and maybe that would help move this along. It's sort of a strategy to
And we're working on that with HART, so if we get moving on the RFP, then it makes it easier to go to the MPOs to put it as a priority. And that feeds into our conversation with the Tampa Bay Partnership and looking at corridors,
Yeah.
MPO mergers.
Yep. And that's a good characterization. The only thing I'd quibble with is Tampa Bay Next. I don't call it a project. It's more of a process.
It's a process.
Yeah.
They said that.
We'll see what projects emerge in 2018.
Are you looking for a recommendation from the planning committee?
I think this is
More informational at this point?
It's more for informational at this point. I think we've gotten the direction from the TMA leadership group to work with Brad, Cassandra, counterparts in Hart and Pasco, and bring back this is not a very refined plan. It's very high level, but bring back something that's more concrete, more specific, maybe with some cost and detailed operation plan that we could then program and then really advance as a package. And this is the kind of thing that when we do our priority list next year would be a real priority project and not just nice things to do when it all shakes out, which is kind of what our priority list looks like now at the regional level. But this would be a real package of projects. And that's the goal, is to get something specific that we know the dollar amount, we know what the state ask is, we know what the local needs would be in terms of funding, and then to be as specific about it as we can.
Madam Chair, I think the key here is also legislative delegation. That these numbers up there, their desire for regional transit seems like there's a huge disconnect that we need to
There really
help
is.
them understand.
Yeah, and a great example of that is the new TBar legislation that went into effect calls for TBARTA to create this regional transit development plan. There is zero substance behind those words. We don't know what it means. We don't know how that opens the door to any kind of funding. Is that different than PSTA's transit development plan? I sure hope so. And I think that's the opportunity to maybe put some dollars behind the regional transit development plan that's in the TBARTA legislation, because nowhere else in Florida legislation is there reference to a regional transit development plan. It's not a statutory requirement. It's not something that's really been promoted much. But I think it's a good idea for this region. It's just we got to now fill that in. And I had a meeting with the chairman of the Bay Area Legislative Delegation on Monday, Representative Sprouse, and he was very supportive of us bringing back some language about what a regional transit development plan can do. So I think they're open to that. So Councilmember Johnson, it's a great suggestion. We just need to be unified about it. Thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity to be here today.
Thank you, Ed. Hello, Commissioner Torga. We started off our meeting with the Regional Express bus proposal presentation, so we're going to backtrack a little bit and take up our action item, which is a review of our May 17th meeting minutes. So if anyone has any, well, I'm sorry.
I just wanted to remind you about calling if there was any public comment.
Oh, yes. Is there any public comment today before we approve our minutes? Okay, seeing none. Thank you for that reminder. Any comments, questions about our minutes? If not, I'll take a motion to approve our minutes.
I make a motion to approve our minutes of May 17, 2017.
Okay,
Second.
all in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Okay, unanimous. We're going to go ahead with our transit feasibility plan, right? Or are we going to,
Yeah, I'm going to keep it short because this presentation was supposed to be given at the TMA. I know I think more than half of you were at the TMA. You know that a lot of the discussion went over time. We've made it our plan to bring to this committee the information that goes to the TMA on a regular basis about the regional transit feasibility plan so that we can have a discussion about it here at PSTA. And we've committed to the project team that staff would present this to you as opposed to the consultant for the most part in order to save them some time and some money, but also for us to really focus on the things that are important to us within the context of the regional system. There are three general questions that we're trying to answer, but only the first one is the purview of this plan, and that is what is a project that we can put forward through the FTA process. So there is other discussion about how it's funded and who is responsible for building it, maintaining it. But I think the plan itself is really trying to get to that what question. So in this case, we want to look at what projects have the greatest potential, which projects could go through the FTA process, but also what technologies are we choosing that meet our needs for today, but also meet our needs for tomorrow. The project in general is on schedule, though I think that there's been a couple of changes. That what is the step two after we've talked about the where of things, where things might be. The what question of what kind of technology is the phase that the consultants are in right now, and they're anticipating to bring some preliminary findings to the TMA in September. They wanted us to remind you that they have had a survey, and those over 500 responses are coming up with the same things. We're talking about the same things we've been talking about for a long time. People want access to entertainment venues, those major activity centers. They want to be able to go to the ball game. They want to be able to go to the airport, and most importantly, they want to be able to go to their jobs. And so if we don't start solving these issues, we'll just keep hearing the same comments. There's a large discussion about the data that they've been using, and so they have some slides in here about some of the data and the accuracy of the data that they are using. They are using the MPO projections for a number of reasons. They did look at some other variations of population and employment projections. Here you see the employment data, and what they're using in red is very close to the other data sources that are available to them. They've also been looking at growth. This is just an example of Hillsborough County. I did ask for the Pinellas County map so we could take a look at that. But we can really start to see some of that urban growth areas in Hillsborough County, and they've been using this data as well to start to look at where are we going in terms of our redevelopment. And as I mentioned, they are using the adopted MPO data, which is the right data to use, even though some people have called it into question. So as I mentioned, they are in step two of what is the project that would move forward. They're going from 15 projects, but trying to get to a top 3. In looking at some of the data and where things are and how they might start to look at the capacity of different types of technology. We're first looking at population, where are the highest densities, that is something that is part of the FTA process, as well as employment, trying to get to a medium rating. Here you can see the top corridors from step 1, the top performing corridors, and some of the population densities that they've been looking at. these are some supporting network projects too. So they're starting to look at those top 5 connections, of which there is at least one in Pinellas. I want to make it clear that the Central Avenue BRT is Project 0, meaning that even though it's not specifically mentioned in a lot of the information here, it is the first project that is going forward. So although it may not be a recommendation as the top 3, because it's already in the process, the FTA process, and the idea is to get to the next project in the FTA process. So there are the 5 projects that you'll see at the TMA. I'll go through really quickly, but the consultant will start to recommend some options for technologies that might be appropriate based on population and employment and the ridership projections, focusing on the type of trip that's being taken, being the average trip length, and then also the capacity that's needed. So you might, if for a heavily used route, a steel wheel capacity may be required, but if it doesn't need that kind of capacity, you may be able to use articulated buses and things like that in order to get the projects started. So here, they're saying that one of their top corridors is West Shore to Brandon, which has a very high employment age usage, the 20 to 64, and a large potential for professional riders. Downtown to USF, again, a high amount of service, professional riders, service jobs, but a lower age group. Again, this is in that corridor near USF, and an average trip length of about 4 miles. Wesley Chapel to St. Petersburg, this is a very long corridor, and we've asked them to sort of look at it in pieces because not a lot of people go all the way from Wesley Chapel to downtown St. Pete every day. There are some crossover markets that are happening here, and I think that'll give us a better idea of what is a good project in this corridor. Our alternatives analysis, surprise, surprise, is also one of the top 5 corridors. This makes a lot of sense for us. This is the reason that it was our alternatives analysis. This is the reason that it's the highest investment corridors for us in general. Yes?
Cassandra, I hate to interrupt you, but I think it's important to mention this, and I know I'm preaching to the choir here, but one of the misconceptions and perhaps a misunderstanding that certain people tried to exploit during Greenlight Pinellas was suggesting that the route from St. Pete to Clearwater was long and unnecessary, and that was really not the way to look at it. We're looking at connecting Clearwater and St. Pete to the Gateway area.
Yes.
But people tended to think that, we're trying to build this expensive route to get from St. Pete to Clearwater, and that's not really the case. It's connecting St. Pete and Clearwater to Gateway.
Well, it's much like the Wesley Chapel to downtown St.
Yes.
Pete, where you have multiple markets using that corridor, and understanding the travel patterns are important. When we did the alternative analysis, looking at the Clearwater to Gateway, we found the trips were much shorter and much more localized. The trips from St. Pete to Gateway were much more regional, and they were longer. So you're looking at an average trip length of 6 miles, but we know from previous studies that it may have been 4 miles on the east-west leg and closer to 10 miles on the north-south leg. And again, we also looked at connecting it to downtown Tampa. So we were looking at ridership projections and other markets of going across the bay as well. So this is slightly different, but it is one of the top connections in the region. Lastly, the South Tampa connection, you saw that in the map. There's a lot of redevelopment, a lot of density that's happening in that area. So they will be looking at other factors as they move forward, again, focusing on the modes. You have some handouts in front of you. One is their latest newsletter detailing where they are in the process, and the other is the modes that they're going to be looking at. Again, I mentioned rubber tires, steel wheel. We've talked a little bit about ferry service and other like cable-held transit and things like that, and where that makes sense. We had a long conversation at a staff level about transfers and how you would make those markets work with those kinds of moves. So you'll have this. You will see this again in September with a little bit more detail. Just want to make sure there's a lot of information that they're sort of sifting through, and we did promise that we would bring you the information, and this gives you a chance to digest it a little bit before they get to the recommendations for the modes. I am not going to do this part of their presentation. They have on their team a lobbyist in DC who is very prominent in the transit industry, Jeff Booth, and he has his own consulting firm. He had some insights on what is happening at the administration, and in general, I would say that he was more positive than the news that you're hearing coming out of Washington, in that a lot of the infrastructure plans that are being presented eliminate the capital investment grant program, which is the New Starts program that we are applying for our Central Avenue BRT. Congress is not necessarily on board with eliminating that program. So he believes that we will see a continuation of that program with new projects funded. I think that puts us in a very good position for our Central Avenue BRT because it is a very modest project overall for the projects that are being presented to the New Starts and Small Starts Capital Investment Grant Program. And we are still asking for a 50% share to be covered on the capital side from the feds. This allows us to also apply for state funding, and they have a policy of providing half of the non-federal share, which essentially means that we will come up with 25%, they will come up with 25%, with the 50% being covered by the feds. So I will leave you with that information that you can read through. If you have other questions, we can certainly talk to our own federal advocacy team about some of the details that are in the slides that Jeff presented.
Commissioner Jensen?
I guess I just have to say this. The purpose is to find out what can be funded by the federal process, and they're going through the federal logic. But you ended up saying 25% is going to have to be funded locally.
Yes.
We're not, in my mind, this thing is all out of sequence. We should be talking about what will the local folks fund, and how do we define that need? We just seem to have jumped right by that without thinking about what are the grassroots, what are the stakeholders, what are the constituents? How do we get the proponents to start talking consistently to each group? And especially since we're going and talking about modes, I think we're going to get in trouble, and then people are going to be taking pot shots at the modes instead of talking about what the needs are for this region for the future. And I think this is all, I mean, it appears to me to be a part of DOT's effort to just buzz by the CSX offer instead of really addressing how do we get there in the future.
There's two parts to the federal process, and half of your score when you go into the capital investment grant program is purely technical. And that is the only question that the consultants can answer, is that 50% that is this a good project based on the data? The other half of the score is, as you say, Councilman Johnson, is about the financial capacity of the local sponsor. And that is the question that is on us. And we cannot put that on the consultant to define for us and how we move forward with this. They can say, here are the top 3 technical projects in the region. But if the local sponsor doesn't have the funding to come up with that capital share that is required and the operating dollars to have that service run, then there is no project. And so I think that this is a parallel process that has to happen.
But is that parallel process happening?
Not right now. I mean,
Is that,
are we still talking about this project? As you say, from our perspective, this is the primary project that is on the table for a top 3 slot. And this is not the project that we are talking about right now, although we have talked about it in the past.
If I can just jump in there, I think part of that falls back on us as the MPOs, and in partnership with PSTA and other entities, but we are starting a more open-ended conversation with the broad public about transportation and development in general. And using this as a backdrop, we're not going to be out there advocating for this, but it'll be presented as information, and that's starting around August, certainly by September, where we're going around to different libraries, we're going around to different community locations in Pinellas County to have what we call transportation talks, and just really open-ended conversations about what we need to be doing. So I'm hoping that will complement this, and then when we're through with this project in the beginning of 2018, we need to ramp up those efforts and really have a more focused conversation with folks, broad-based. And that's something that I think Sandra's right. We can't put that on consultants or even DOT to do. We have to be doing that ourselves.
And this is where Whit's presentation and this study start to weave together, in that the data is telling us that this is a good project. But we're going from a local system. We haven't produced that middle piece of that regional bus. And so that's what we have been focusing on, is what is that middle piece, what is that step up to this. And so while this may still be a long-term vision, we're very focused on the incremental steps that we need in order to get to a funded project.
And it's worth noting that before Sunrail began operations in Orlando, there was a Volusia to downtown Orlando express bus that DOT funded. And there was also Lynx initiated service, an express service to downtown Kissimmee from downtown Orlando, which is their most productive route. And that ridership in those corridors helped justify and demonstrate that there was a demand for Sunrail in those corridors. So it hasn't quite panned out in terms of ridership like they would hope on that initial line, but they laid the groundwork with regional express bus between counties. And that's something we need to be mindful of as we go forward.
Great report. Thank you, Cassandra. I have to leave in about 5 minutes, but we'll still have quorum. Okay, leave in 5 minutes too, so we may lose our quorum here. Do we want to do the performance scorecard next?
Well, I think we can maybe just highlight the highlights of both the scorecard and the budget. These are 2 items that will be informational items on your next week's agenda, and then action items coming in part, at least in July and in the future. So as you know, we have been working on a whole new system of management here at PSTA since January, where we are instituting a performance scorecard that is based on quantitative metrics that will drive the whole organization toward accomplishing our mission and vision, which the board adopted last month, and achieving our objectives. So at your places is the draft performance scorecard that you will hopefully be considering for approval, not the whole thing, but considering for approval of the key strategies which are listed for vertically along the side. This is like a scorecard here, and these 5 areas of community support, financial stability, customer satisfaction, employee engagement, and commitment to performance tie directly to the path forward strategic plan of PSTA and to our mission and vision. And then you can see these quantitative metrics listed to the side of them that we will be, this whole process, we will be giving you an update of this scorecard, I think on a quarterly basis, maybe once we get started, maybe to start out on a monthly basis, but then on a quarterly basis, so the board gets an update on where we stand each month. And these are sort of illustrative metrics that are tied to that area of that strategy, as you can see. They're supposed to be outcomes, not outputs. It's not just how hard we work. It's whether or not people like it, people like riding the bus or whatever. This will then tie to a performance evaluation format for me, for the CEO, that will directly be tied to this performance scorecard, and then to all of the employees. All of the employees, and they'll have their own metrics that are related to their piece of the puzzle. What the executive committee, which Chair Rice chairs and Mr. Johnson is on, decided last month was that we would present this in multiple phases to the PSTA board. Next, Mark Ash is going to be here, our consultant, is going to be here next week to present an overview, like I'm just doing right now. And then in July, to approve this scorecard or the strategies that tie to the higher level strategic plan of the organization. Then probably in the fall, we will get the personnel committee together and then the board to approve of the specific performance evaluation format that will look very similar to this, but will be for the CEO evaluation, and all of the employees' evaluations will you'll see that and approve that sort of framework. So that's a very brief overview of, and you'll hear a presentation from Mark at the meeting next week. Debbie, you want to hit the highlights of the budget?
Do you want me to go through the PowerPoint fast or just hit highlights?
I would say that one slide that says the budget's looking good except for health insurance. There it is.
It's doing everywhere.
Yeah.
Not this one?
That one.
That one. Okay. Actually, it's always nice to be able to present positive news when we've been working hard on the budget. And there's a lot of positive news in here. We have no changes in service, no change in the millage. We have come up with ways of mitigating some very high increases in health insurance. We're right now on a solicitation so that we're not passing on as much to the employee as is contractually required. We also are balanced through 2021, and we've come up with some innovative ways of handling the hybrid components for the buses, which cost for the hybrid electrics, which cost a lot of money and will actually save us some. So we are doing this all while considering that we are taking into consideration a $2 million per year hit with the homestead exemption. So we've been able to accomplish quite a bit. And do you want me to go to the one more slide?
And then the capital. This one's the capital right there. And the capital. Go back. The bottom part is about the capital.
I did that. Oh, but yeah, the hybrid batteries. Again, that's going to save us a considerable amount of money. It's something innovative where we're going to take the components parts, pay for it with PSTA dollars, and that way we can save a lot of money to do that. So in next year's budget, we'll be seeing receipt of our electric buses, more BAE or hybrid electric buses in there as well. And we are balanced through 2021, which is better than we had anticipated when we presented last year.
The Finance Committee saw this presentation before you did, and Debbie will present it at the board meeting next week. There was a lot of discussion about the health insurance costs because they are going up substantially. And while we are looking at ways of restructuring the health program to save money, we're also very focused on the amount of money, the split between how much the employees pay for health insurance and PSTA pays for health insurance of the overall premium. Some cities still provide free health care to their employees, where the employee doesn't have to pay anything. PSTA is not in that situation. They pay, a single pays $23 a paycheck currently. It's going up so much that the contractual formula we normally use, in our estimation, would make health insurance too expensive for most of our employees to pay for, and actually lead to a challenge for us in recruiting new employees to come work here. Because a majority of the employees we're hiring are not millennials, they are mid-career people that have already had a job that are coming here. One of the main reasons is for the health insurance. That's why they are applying for the PSTA bus driver jobs. And in order to keep a good recruitment stream going, we're proposing to mitigate that very large increase, potential large increase to the employees, to something more reasonable, going up from $23 a paycheck to $29 is what we've got in there. But hopefully, we'll save some money on the overall premiums by doing different things, so that'll be less of an issue. The Finance Committee had a lot of discussion on that, and then of course they're very eager to find out when we're going to talk about the type of buses we want to buy, which we have put off this year to consolidate with the budget discussion. And I told them we'll have that robust discussion about that in August, starting in August and September.
And we've gone through putting this budget together over the last few months. You have it online, but if anybody wants a hard copy for your reading pleasure over the summer, we have extra copies, and we'll be handing them out also at the board meeting next week.
Excellent.
Any questions? I have a quick question in terms of the catastrophic cost. Do we have a
Yes,
sense of how much of that may be like accidents that we could address through better safety training programs?
Nothing of it relates to that. Our health insurance claims costs have gone up about 75% over the last 2 years due to catastrophic claims losses.
Mhm.
Now, we have a significant number of cancer patients right now over the last 2 years, and different things like that. And we're addressing the more chronic illnesses of diabetes, heart disease through various wellness programs. So we just happen to have, and it happens, it's cyclical. Every entity will run into it at some point where you just have 2 years or 2 or 3 years where it goes up. We don't expect it to continue at this rate, but we certainly have to take some action to help contain the cost while we're in this period.
Understood.
I have one. Workers' comp.
We do very well at it, yes. We do, we have very few claims here.
Okay,
Yeah.
I understand that we have few claims, but as a business owner, I know that they just upped ours 18%, and we're looking at maybe 24%.
Yeah, we are anticipating a much lower increase than that in the budget. Our claims experience has been excellent, so we're not expecting that. But I know there's some changes in the law.
There's a rating that they give your organization, right?
Yes.
That's how your rate is calculated.
Right, and when you have large claims, it stays on for 2 years. Before it drops off, you kind of get penalized for 3 years.
Well, okay, I was referring to what the legislature did, is doing.
Right, there's some changes.
It's
in
coming,
laws.
big changes. So,
But we haven't seen that.
yeah.
Yeah, so few claims, but yes.
we're running a little bit out over time here. I know two of us have something to get to, so if we don't have any more questions or comments, I think we can adjourn our meeting now, and we'll see each other next week at our general board meeting. Thank you, everybody.
And I'll see you tomorrow. When is Express coming in with that meeting? Express is coming in.
Everyone's welcome to join us riding the bus at Pride Parade on Saturday.
Great.
Oh, no, that's okay. Thanks for your email.
Well, it's just later.
We'll meet before the meeting or one-on-one.
I hope so.
Okay.
The president?